I'm very excited today to introduce Skye Pearman-Gilman, who will be giving a talk entitled Drivers and Consequences of Landscape Change for New England Wildlife. And so Skye's connection to the NELF Explorer project goes back before there even was NELF Explorer to when to the scenarios development process, the NELF scenarios development. And at the time, Skye was a PhD student at the University of Vermont. And she used the NELF scenarios in her research on the effects of land use change for New England wildlife. Now she's completed her PhD in natural resources. And she's currently working as a freelance research analyst with American Wind Wildlife Institute and the University of Vermont. And her areas of interest and expertise are wildlife conservation, data analytics, and computer modeling. And so with that, I will hand the floor over to Skye, and thank you.
Thanks, Marissa, for that intro. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint pulled up here. Hold on. Let's see here. Guess I'll share that screen. And let's do this. Okay, can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Okay, let's close this down. Okay, hi everyone. As Marissa just said, my name is Skye Pearman-Gilman. And today I'm going to be talking about some of my graduate research with the University of Vermont. And the research I'll be talking about today is focused on evaluating how different drivers and trajectories of landscape change may influence the distribution change for wildlife species in the New England region. So as we all know, climate and land use patterns are changing worldwide. And those changes can have various economic and ecological consequences within different regions. So for this study, we focused on the New England region and aimed to better understand how changes in climate and land use may impact the future distribution and long-term success of wildlife species within this region. So in order to improve our understanding of wildlife futures here in New England, this study focused on three primary objectives. The first is to estimate and map our species distribution relative to current conditions and scenario projected future conditions. We can use those maps to address our second objective, which is to evaluate how different scenarios and drivers of landscape change may influence distribution change for our focal wildlife species. We can then take that information and go one step further to identify which drivers of landscape change are having the greatest influence on distribution change for our focal wildlife. So we decided to include 10 species in this study, and these are the 10 species displayed here. These are all species that are commonly managed or harvested in New England. Since harvested species bring in revenue for management agencies and are a large focus of our wildlife management programs, we wanted to focus our assessment on these species that have social, ecological, and economic relevance within New England. So in order to evaluate how climate and landscape changes may impact these species, we used these distribution models that are shown here. And these are all models that we developed through expert elicitation and mixed modeling methods. So each of these models includes these variables that are influential on that species distribution, on driving that species distribution. And each of those variables is also associated with an effect size that we were able to obtain through these models. So The model that's displayed on the bottom here is our model for American black bear. And today, throughout this talk, I'm just going to use American black bear as an example species to kind of give you an idea of the work we've done. And so anytime you see this little black bear image in the top corner there, just know you are seeing results that are associated with that species. However, we did conduct these same methods and produce similar outputs for all 10 of these species pictured here. So once we had our models for these species, we could use them to map our species distribution. So to do this, we can take our distribution model for our species, as well as spatial land cover data for our region of interest. And we applied that model across that landscape to estimate our species regional distribution. So what we're seeing here is a current distribution map for black bear, where our red regions are areas of high occurrence probability and likely favorable habitat condition for that species. And those blue regions are areas of lower likelihood of occurrence for that species. So we used this approach to develop distribution maps for all of our focal species. So this provided us with this regional information about our species' current distribution for all 10 of our focal wildlife species. So again, here we're seeing these red regions are areas of high occurrence probability for that species. And those blue regions are areas of low occurrence probability. So not only do these maps provide us with information about the current distribution of each of these species, they also give us this baseline to assess how future changes within this landscape may impact these species. So in order to conduct these assessments about future change, we needed information about how the New England landscape may change in the future. And this is where our collaboration with the New England Landscape Futures Project came in. So I assume everyone here is familiar with this project and knows that the NELFP developed these 5 landscape projections, one based on recent trends or a continuation of recent trends, and then these 4 alternative scenarios to the recent trend scenario. And these 4 alternative scenarios are built around these 2 high impact and highly uncertain drivers of landscape change, which are natural resource planning and innovation on the y-axis there, and then socioeconomic connectedness on the x-axis. So really all I want to highlight here is that these scenarios and this scenario framework provides a lot of information about how the New England landscape may change by the year 2060. And this is information that we can use to evaluate how changes within this landscape may impact our wildlife. So we can take these forecasted spatial outputs for each of these scenarios and use them to estimate our species' future distribution. So rather than using our current conditions data, like we did to develop our current conditions distribution maps, we can use this scenario projected data and apply our species model to that projected future conditions to estimate our species' future distribution. So here we're seeing what the distribution of American black bear may look like in the year 2060 if the New England landscape changes following a similar trajectory to that of the growing global scenario. So using these, our species models and these different scenario maps, we can develop these distribution projections relative to each of these scenarios. So here we have our current conditions distribution map for black bear, as well as these projected distributions for the year 2060 relative to these 5 different trajectories of landscape change. So the nice thing about these maps is that they show us how much of the region will represent potentially good habitat under each of these scenarios. And they also show us where within this landscape we're likely to find favorable habitat conditions and high occurrence probabilities for these species. So these maps can be useful for many different assessments. One which we're particularly interested in for this study is understanding how distribution may change over the next 50 years. So to evaluate distribution change, we took our current conditions maps and we compared them against our scenario projected maps to estimate the degree of change between those two distributions. So here we're seeing a distribution change map for black bear, where those orange and red regions are areas that are showing that future habitat conditions are less favorable for that species, and that's leading to a lower likelihood of occurrence for our target species. And then the green regions are areas where we're seeing improved habitat conditions and higher occurrence probability under those future conditions. So this example is, again, for the growing global scenario, but we did estimate distribution change for each of the 5 NELFP scenarios. So here we have these scenario-specific maps that provide the spatially explicit information about how each scenario may impact our species distribution. So we developed maps like these for all 10 of our focal species, which allowed us to kind of compare information across our species and look at trends in our distribution change. So here we're seeing regional statistics for our focal species, where we have percent change in regional occurrence probability between 2010 and 2060 on the y-axis, and that's dispersed across the x-axis by species and scenario. So the main takeaway here is that we're seeing that the distribution for our focal species is expected to decline over the next 50 years. And these declines can be quite considerable for certain species. So taking like moose as an example here, we see a almost 60% decline under the Yankee cosmopolitan scenario. However, we do see that some scenarios are that there's quite a bit of variability among some of our scenarios. So again, looking at moose, we can see that under the go it alone scenario, there's only about a 20% decline in regional occurrence, and that's a pretty considerable change from what we're expecting under the Yankee cosmopolitan scenario. So this is important to understand because understanding which of these scenarios and drivers of landscape change are leading to these lower levels of decline can provide useful information for conservation and management planning for these species. So looking back at our scenario maps and our scenario framework here, not only do we have information about these scenario-specific distribution change, but the scenario framework also provides us with an opportunity to isolate and evaluate how these different directional drivers on our scenario axis influence distribution change. So for example, if we want to evaluate how global socioeconomic connectedness, or as we're going to call it now, the global SCC driver, impacts our target species, we can take the 2 distribution change maps associated with that global driver, and we can combine information among these scenarios to marginalize the influence of our secondary drivers and target the influence of this global SCC driver. So in this case, we can combine our distribution change information about our Yankee cosmopolitan scenario and our growing global scenario to marginalize the influence of our high and low NRPI drivers and target the influence of our global SCC driver. We can then also subtract changes that are expected under recent trends to really highlight the changes that are specifically associated with that global driver. So we combined information across each of the axes on the scenario framework to isolate changes associated with each driver of landscape change. So from this process, we were able to generate these maps of driver-specific distribution change. So these maps are showing the isolated influence that our local global SCC drivers and our high and low NRPI drivers have on distribution change. And within the maps, we're seeing areas in green are showing you areas where that driver led to an increase in occurrence probability compared to recent trends. And those purple or pink areas are showing you areas where that driver led to a decrease in occurrence probability compared to recent trends. So we developed maps like these and also quantified these driver impacts for all 10 of our species, which allowed us to compare impacts among the species and drivers. So this graph is showing how each of these drivers influenced distribution change relative to recent trends. So the intersection between the X and Y axis is the recent trends baseline for each species. And each bar is showing us how that driver shifted average regional occurrence from what was expected under recent trends. So at first glance, we really see that most of the bars have positive values. And that means that these landscape changes associated with these drivers improved the outlook for many wildlife species, leading to these higher regional occurrence than what was expected under the continuation of recent trends. We also see that different drivers have a greater influence on individual species. So looking at gray fox as an example, we see that the low NRPI and the global SCC driver had a larger impact on distribution change compared to the high NRPI and local SCC drivers. I mean, that's kind of a trend we see across a lot of these species. We're seeing that certain drivers have a much larger impact comparatively to other ones for individual species. So this figure kind of gives us a nice snapshot of which drivers are most influential on distribution change for an individual species. However, we can also overlay this information to look at trends within this focal group. So here we're looking at the relative effect that each driver has on distribution change. And as before, we see that there is variability among the species and the drivers. But overall, we're seeing that this graph is kind of skewed towards the low NRPI and the global SCC driver. And this is because these drivers had the strongest influence on distribution change for the largest subset of the focal group. We also compared the cumulative effect that NRPI and SCC had on distribution change. And we found that natural resource planning and innovation had the strongest cumulative impact on our focal species. However, we are seeing that the effect of socioeconomic connectedness is also similar in strength. So overall, these results really indicate that both natural resource planning and socioeconomic factors are influencing our wildlife species. And this highlights the importance of considering these factors when developing conservation and management plans. Especially since changes associated with these drivers can improve the outlook for wildlife in the future. So before I open it up to questions, I just want to quickly acknowledge our collaborators and contributors of this research. This work was funded by the USDA McIntyre Stennis program, and wouldn't have been possible without the support and collaboration of the University of Vermont and the Vermont Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. I'd also like to acknowledge the folks at Harvard Forest, Matthew Dovnik in particular, for really facilitating our collaboration with the New England Landscape Futures Project. So with that, thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions. We kind of sped through that, so I'm sure everyone has questions.
Thank you so much, Skye. So we'll open it up for questions, and I just want to note that I'm going to pause or I'll stop the recording, and anyone who's joined us for the recorded talk can read a summary of the Q&A in the notes document that'll be posted along with the video. But for those asking questions, that portion of the presentation will not be recorded. And also, Skye, I'm glad you put on the screen the publications, because that's also important references that came out of this work. So with that, I'll stop the recording.